I lived in a quiet suburban town, the kind of place where everyone knows their neighbors and the loudest sound is usually the lawnmower on a Saturday morning. After 4 decades as a school principal, I had retired to a life of gardening, reading, and enjoying the peace I had earned. My world was small, but content, centered around my only daughter, Sophia. But a single knock on my door in the dead of night was all it took to shatter that peace and plunge me into a battle I never imagined I'd have to fight. This is the story of how my son-in-law's betrayal forced me to use every lesson in strategy and discipline I'd ever learned to dismantle his life, piece by piece. The knock at 1 a.m. The knock was frantic, a rapid, desperate pounding that sliced through the silence of the night. It wasn't the polite rap of a neighbor or the cheerful tap of a friend. This was the sound of trouble, the kind that makes your heart leap into your throat before you're even fully awake. I threw on my robe, my mind racing through a Rolodex of potential disasters. Had Mrs. Gable from next door fallen again? Was there a fire? My hand trembled slightly as I reached the front door and peered through the peephole. What I saw stole the air from my lungs. It was my daughter, Sophia. Her face was a mess of tear tracks and smudged mascara, her usually bright eyes wide with terror and pain. But it was the angry, blooming bruise on her cheek and the split in her lower lip that made my blood run cold. I fumbled with the locks, my fingers suddenly clumsy, and pulled the door open. She practically fell into my arms, her body trembling uncontrollably as sobs racked her slender frame. "Mom," she choked out, her voice barely a whisper. "He hit me." The words hung in the air, heavy and poisonous. I guided her inside, my arm wrapped tightly around her, and led her to the overstuffed armchair in the living room. I knelt before her, gently tilting her face to the light to get a better look. The bruise was already darkening from an angry red to a sickening purple. Fury, cold and pure, ignited in my chest. I had spent my life protecting this child, from scraped knees to broken hearts, and to see her like this, hurt by the man who had vowed to love and protect her, was a violation I couldn't comprehend. "Mark?" I asked, my voice dangerously quiet. She could only nod, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. "We were arguing," she stammered, trying to catch her breath between sobs. "About money again. He's been so different lately, so angry all the time. He said some awful things, and I told him I was tired of it. Then he snapped." I held her hand, my knuckles white. Mark, her husband of 5 years, the charming, successful sales manager who had swept my daughter off her feet. He had always been the model son-in-law, polite, attentive, always bringing flowers and remembering my birthday. I had trusted him. I had welcomed him into our family, believing he would cherish Sophia as much as I did. That image was now dissolving, replaced by the monstrous reality of a man who could raise a hand to his wife. I got her a glass of water and a cool cloth for her face. As she drank, her trembling slowly subsided, replaced by a weary exhaustion. She told me the rest of the story in disjointed fragments. The arguments had been getting worse for months, always about money. Mark was secretive about their finances, claiming his bonuses were smaller than expected and that they needed to cut back. Yet he continued to spend lavishly on himself. New suits, expensive dinners with quote-unquote clients, a new watch he claimed was a gift from his company. Sophia, a dedicated elementary school teacher, had tried to be understanding, even taking on extra tutoring work to help make ends meet. Tonight, the dam had broken. She had discovered a credit card statement hidden in his desk drawer, one she had never seen before. It was filled with charges she couldn't explain. Jewelry from a high-end boutique, lingerie, weekend trips to a romantic inn upstate. When she confronted him, he had exploded. He called her paranoid and ungrateful, and when she wouldn't back down, he slapped her across the face. The shock of it, she said, was even worse than the pain. He had looked at her with such coldness, such contempt. In that moment, she realized she was looking at a stranger. She had grabbed her keys and fled, driving straight to the one place she knew she would be safe, my house. As she spoke, the principal in me began to take over. the part of me that dealt with bullies, liars, and crises with calm, methodical precision. Emotion was a luxury I couldn't afford right now. Sophia needed a protector, and I needed a plan. "You're not going back there," I said, my tone leaving no room for argument. "Not tonight, not ever. You'll stay here. This is your home." She looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of relief and fear. "What am I going to do, Mom?" "First," I said, helping her to her feet, "you're going to get some sleep in your old room. In the morning, we'll go to the doctor and we'll file a police report." She flinched at the mention of the police. I don't know." "Sophia, listen to me," I said, my voice firm but gentle. "This cannot be a secret. Men like him count on shame and silence. We will not give him that power." I settled her into bed, tucking her in like I did when she was a little girl who'd had a nightmare. But this was no nightmare she could wake up from. As I watched her finally drift into a troubled sleep, the fury I had suppressed returned with a vengeance. It wasn't a hot, reckless anger, but a cold, focused rage. Mark had not just hurt my daughter, he had declared war on my family. And as a principal, I had learned one thing very well. You don't reason with a bully. You dismantle their power, you expose their weaknesses, and you make sure they can never hurt anyone again. Sitting in the dark of my silent living room, with the first hint of dawn on the horizon, I knew this was just the beginning. Mark had no idea who he had just crossed. Chapter 2. The Unspoken Truth. The next morning was a blur of grim necessities. A visit to an urgent care clinic confirmed what we already knew: a fractured cheekbone. The doctor, a kind woman with gentle hands and sympathetic eyes, documented everything meticulously. Then came the police station. It was as soul-crushing as I had anticipated. Sophia, her face pale and swollen, had to recount the events of the previous night to a tired-looking officer who typed her statement with methodical slowness. I watched her, my heart aching with a mixture of pride and sorrow. She was so strong, so much stronger than she knew, but she shouldn't have to be this strong. Mark, of course, had already started his offensive. His texts began flooding Sophia's phone while we were at the station. They were a masterclass in manipulation, cycling through a predictable pattern. First came the apologies, dripping with false remorse. "Baby, I'm so sorry. I don't know what came over me. I'm a monster. Please come home so we can talk." When those were ignored, the tone shifted to desperate pleading. "I can't live without you, Sophia. Don't do this to us. I'll do anything. I'll go to therapy. Anything you want." Finally, when silence was his only answer, the threats began. Subtle at first, then more direct. "Don't you dare try to ruin my life over one mistake. You know what people will think. You're being hysterical." I took the phone from her. "Block his number," I said, "and his email and all his social media. We are building a wall and he is not getting through." We also got a temporary restraining order. As the judge signed the papers, I felt the first small flicker of victory. It was a piece of paper, yes, but it was a start. It was a clear line drawn in the sand. Later that afternoon, I called Robert. Robert was my late husband's best friend and a retired police detective. If anyone knew how to navigate the murky waters we were entering, it was him. He was at my house within an hour, his presence a comforting balm of quiet competence. He listened intently as I recounted the story, his expression growing grimmer with each detail. He looked at the photos of Sophia's injuries, his jaw tight. "Good work on the police report and the TRO, Eleanor," he said, his voice a low rumble. "But a man who does this once will do it again. And his behavior now, it's not just about a bad temper. Hiding finances, lavish spending, a secret credit card. That's not just an argument about money. That's a secret life." His words confirmed the suspicion that had been festering in my gut since Sophia had mentioned the credit card statement, the jewelry, the lingerie, the weekend trips to a romantic inn. It was a classic, almost cliché script. There was another woman. "The mistress," I said, the word tasting like poison. "Almost certainly," Robert agreed. "And if he has a mistress, he has secrets. And secrets are leverage." He explained that Mark's entire life was likely built on a carefully constructed image: the successful husband, the rising star at his company, the respectable member of the community. A domestic violence charge and a messy divorce would be a crack in that facade.
but exposing an affair, especially if company funds were involved, could shatter it completely. "He's a sales manager," you said, Robert mused. "They have expense accounts. They travel. It's easy to hide things. The first thing we need to do is find out who she is and how deep this goes." My mind, accustomed to organizing school curriculums and managing budgets, started to click into a new gear. This was no longer just about protecting Sophia. It was about seeking justice. It was about ensuring Mark faced the full consequences of his actions. "He's arrogant," I said, thinking of all the times he'd boasted about his sales records and his importance to his company. "He'll be careless." "Arrogant men always are," Robert said with a grim smile. "They believe their own lies. That's his weakness. We just need to find the loose thread and the whole thing will unravel." That evening, after Robert left,
With the identity of the mistress
Sophia and I
confirmed and the existence of the secret apartment established, our focus shifted from discovery to documentation. Robert was adamant about this. "A story is just a story without proof," he had told me over the phone. "We need irrefutable evidence. Photos, documents, anything that a lawyer can use and a human resources department can't ignore." This was my domain. As a principal, I knew that building a case against a problematic teacher or a neglectful parent required a mountain of paperwork, a clear timeline, and evidence that was beyond dispute. We would apply the same methodical rigor to Mark. Our first objective was to get visual confirmation of Mark and Jessica together at the apartment. Hiring a private investigator was an option, but it was expensive and could be traced. Robert, ever resourceful, had a better idea. He had an old friend in the surveillance business who owed him a favor. For 2 days, a discreet van was parked down the street from the Northwood apartment complex. The results were exactly what we expected, and yet seeing them was still a punch to the gut for Sophia. The investigator provided a folder of high-resolution photographs. Mark and Jessica entering the building together, his arm possessively around her waist, the two of them kissing on the balcony, Mark using his key to let them into the apartment. There was even a shot of him carrying her groceries in, playing the part of the devoted partner. It was a complete life, a carbon copy of the one he was supposed to have with my daughter, just with a different woman. We now had a date and time-stamped visual record of his infidelity. Next was the financial ammunition. Sophia, with my guidance, began the process of meticulously separating their finances. This was a critical step, not just for the divorce, but for the next phase of our plan. She opened a new bank account in her name only and had her teaching salary redirected there. We went through every joint account statement from the past 2 years, creating a detailed spreadsheet. We categorized every expenditure: household bills, groceries, mortgage payments, and then, in a separate, damning column, all of Mark's suspicious and unexplained spending. We cross-referenced the dates of his business trips with the charges on his secret credit card. The weekend he was supposedly at a conference in Boston, his card showed charges for a spa resort in the Berkshires, a place Jessica had posted photos from on that very same weekend. The client dinner that ran late, a charge for a couple's cooking class. The spreadsheet grew into a devastating chronicle of his betrayal, quantified in dollars and cents. It showed not just infidelity, but a calculated financial draining of the marital assets. He had spent over $30,000 on his affair in the last year alone. The most crucial piece of the puzzle, however, lay within his company. Robert had a hunch that Mark's deception wasn't limited to his personal life. A man who lies this easily and this often doesn't just stop when he clocks in for work, he reasoned. Sales guys, especially the slick ones, often blur the lines on their expense reports. If he's using a company card to fund any part of this, he's committed fraud. And that's a firing offense. Getting our hands on his expense reports seemed impossible, but Sophia remembered something. Mark often complained about how tedious they were and would sometimes work on them from their home computer. She had a shared login for the family laptop.
With bated breath, she logged in and navigated to the company's expense portal, which he had foolishly saved the password for in the browser. And there it was, his entire expense history for the past 18 months. We hit the print button and waited as page after page of his lies spooled out of my printer. We spent the entire night going through them, armed with our spreadsheet and a set of highlighters. The overlap was flagrant. Lunches at the Gilded Spoon in Northwood were listed as Client Meeting J. Miller. He was using Jessica's real name, likely assuming no one would ever check. Dinners on weekends were expensed. He had even claimed mileage for his trips to the secret apartment, listing them as traveled to a client's office. He wasn't just a cheater, he was a thief, stealing from his own company to finance his affair. By the time the sun rose, the dining table was covered in our evidence. We had the photos, we had the bank statements, we had the secret credit card bills, and now we had the fraudulent expense reports. We had gathered all of the pieces of his secret life and laid them out in the cold, hard light of day. I looked at Sophia. The past week had been a crucible for her. She was thinner, and there were dark circles under her eyes, but the look of a victim was gone. In place was a quiet, unshakable resolve. She was no longer just the wronged wife. She was the architect of his downfall. "We have everything," she said, her voice steady. "Everything and more," I confirmed. "Now we assemble it. We're going to create a package, a neat, undeniable, and utterly devastating portfolio of his character, one for our lawyer and one for a very special delivery." The time for gathering evidence was over. The time for planning the endgame had begun.